Well, welcome and thank you for joining us today for another in the series of strategic thinking concepts, the interviews. Much is said daily about the clash of civilizations. Today, another clash, not unlike the one discussed by Huntington between Christians and Muslims, is playing out. The clash is a point of tension that each of us struggles with daily as we continue to explore the Internet of Everything and the industrial age we're now entering into. It is that clash between our personal rights versus the need for public safety. Increasingly, all of us are developing that growing awareness of the efficiencies and effectiveness of the Internet of Everything and its initiatives, and the collaborative commons that on its face improving our lives, from smartphones to nanotechnology to artificial intelligence to virtual reality. But as we step through this looking glass, do we understand the dark side that will prevent us from ever going back? It is this dark side of the Internet of Everything, as business practitioners, we need to understand. This transformational shift in every business sector and industry will be evident in the political, economic, societal, technical, and yes, even cultural ecosystems that we play in daily. The drive towards a zero marginal cost economy where goods become abundant, repetitive jobs will disappear and replaced by artificial intelligence and robotics, the advent of alternative energy that is nearly free, and other similar emerging challenges will leave little choice as business practitioners to move quickly to exploit the opportunities or mitigate the damage this new industrial age will present. Only the quick and the dead, and that's the reality. Today, we want to look at one small part of the dark side, and that are the notions of data security, data privacy, data sovereignty, and data censorship that daily challenge us to find this appropriate balance between this clash between our personal rights and the need for public safety. Today, I'm delighted to have a very skilled practitioner to take moments to share with us some observations on this dark side, a specialist with internationally recognized competencies in the management of privacy and information issues. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Emeritus David Flaherty, Queen's Counsel. Dave, welcome today.
Thank you.
Dave, let's go from the general to the specific. But before we start, I think it's fair to say that the first question we're going to discuss is Royal Roads, and some of the observations and comments you make will have equal application in large part to all of your businesses and organizations. So with that background, David, can you provide us first a very short overview, an executive summary, if you would, of the BC Freedom of Information Act and some of the exemption clauses?
Yeah. I said to Terry before we started this conversation that if there's any message I wanted to leave with the audience, it's that you're always creating records, whether it's on the dark side of the internet, whether you're entering a university like Royal Roads, whether you're bidding on a contract with a crown corporation, whether you're reading a newspaper, we're creating records around us constantly, and especially digital records. I have a half-functioning cell phone in my pocket, which I'm not going to tell stories about, but that thing is following me around all the time. I'm aware of what it's doing for me. And the second critical message I want to leave with you, even though it's the beginning of the conversation, is that all of our Western industrial democracies have privacy or data protection legislation and freedom of information or openness accountability legislation. Most of it primarily applies to the government. But, for example, in British Columbia, our private sector is regulated. 380,000 organizations are subject to the BC Personal Information Protection Act. And it's about 100 pages, and it's based around 10 principles of privacy practice, the most important being consent. So most of the time, if you're creating a record, you want to know in advance that you're creating a record, and you're consenting to creating the record in one way or another. For example, if Terry was a physician or a GP and I was seeing him, we'd be working on the basis of implied consent. If I went to see him to have my tonsils checked or something else done, I'd be assuming he would collect information about me. I'd be assuming he'd be creating a record of the encounter, partly because he wants to get paid. If he was a skilled practitioner, he'd have an electronic medical record. Well, would that get me excited? Only if I didn't think that the skilled practitioner had thought about the software he was buying, the security controls are in place with the vendor, the cloud that is probably being stored in doesn't ask what country is it going to be stored in. Is it being stored in Eastern Europe in some odd place, which would unnerve me a bit. So on the one hand, I want to remind you that there's privacy legislation, there's openness legislation, and once you're aware that it exists, you'll be less frightened by it.
In fact, I was operated, David, with the understanding that even the dust balls in my desk drawer belong to the state, and if the state want to, citizens want to have a look at those dust balls going through the process, they should be entitled to see, subject to the exemption clauses. I own nothing in the system.
Well, I mean, it's not quite as dire as you're describing it, and nobody's too interested in your dust balls. In fact, the greatest protection we have for our privacy is most people don't care that much about other people, or about, unless you're world famous or you're Barack Obama or
Donald Trump.
Or you do Donald Trump. I'd like to try to avoid Donald Trump today if we can.
You can see the different views right here between Plato and Aristotle playing out.
Most of us are protected in our everyday life. For example, we use email recklessly. We don't often think enough about what we put into an email. We write an email and we send it, which you should have put away and thought about overnight, especially if you're sending one to your boss or to your ex-wife or your current girlfriend or whatever else, your children. Email is not secure. And the big companies, the Microsofts of this world, have not made automatic encryption of email possible. So anytime you use email, it's relatively insecure. What are we protected by? There's millions and millions and millions and millions of emails floating around. But still, one should be very cautious what one puts into an email. I was using the example with Terry a few minutes ago that a story this week of some Harvard students were admitted to Harvard, and then for somehow the admissions department found them saying really stupid things on the internet in a chat room, and there it was racist or something like that, and the admission was withdrawn. So I would have thought you would be admitted on the basis of your grades and your reputation and stuff like that, and they wouldn't be chasing after you around the internet.
David, my understanding is, in talking to a number of HR folks, increasingly they're putting greater reliance on social media to have a look at you and what your values are and how close your culture will align with their culture. And if you make statements like that young lady the other day, 23 years old, that leaked some stuff on the Trump and Russian thing, I'm surprised with the blatancy that it came out, and she paid a price for it.
I think what's important here is that the social norms of social media from a privacy protection, data protection point of view are still evolving. And one of the federal agencies just announced that it was prohibiting its staff who were investigating fraud by claimants for disability and things like that from going to the internet.
I saw that.
And I think I shared that clipping with you. I was very surprised by it because in general, especially if it's kind of a law enforcement issue, you claim you can't work, but your Facebook account is showing you running marathons.
Standing on your head in the corner.
I mean, so you never know whether the actual limits in the law are going to be enforced. Let me give you an odd point. Yes, there's open government legislation, but the legislation is full of all the reasons why the government doesn't have to disclose certain information about certain kinds of things. There's privacy legislation, but if you read it, you'd be surprised that it actually authorizes your use of your personal information, collection, use, and disclosure and retention for all kinds of legitimate purposes that are, quote, in the public interest.
But it's also an unfair, what do you say with it, an unfair position. If I want those services from the bank, or I want that loan from the bank, or I want to subscribe to Google or Apple and use iTunes, what are the choices? If I don't sign up, I don't get iTunes. It's not a fair position, it seems to me.
I'm one of these odd people who reads the terms of service and the privacy policies of vendors. Usually I'm being paid by my clients to read them.
Yeah.
And many of them are preposterous. And most people don't ever look at all the studies show you want to use your Google app, you just click yes, you accept the terms of service. And you don't have no idea what's in it. You really depend on the staff of Privacy Commissioner's Office, Information Commissioner's Office to look at those sorts of things. I'm a former Information and Privacy Commissioner here in British Columbia. I was the first one in the 1990s, and I've done full-time consulting work since then, particularly in the health field. And I have to look at these things for my clients. And often, a company will not even know the data protection legislation that regulates their collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. So it's not open sesame, and they're going to get a big surprise because you can make a privacy complaint to the company, and if you don't get satisfied, you go to the privacy commissioner.
But most of us, David, are just simple people, not skilled in law as you are, not skilled in this particular area. 3 pages of fine print. We have to say, even if in my case, I'm a lawyer as well, but in most cases, reading it, eyes would glaze over and just click.
Yeah.
Who speaks for us? Who takes care
well,
of
the
us?
terms of service I read yesterday for a local health company based in Vancouver that sells in the United States, Canada, etc., I'll leave its name out, was 19 pages. That was just the terms of service. And they were totally geared in favor of the client and against any user. So, and yet we don't, this was a very small 14-person startup based in Vancouver, run by a family doctor. We don't have bargaining power with the Googles of this world or with Facebook. And I perhaps have said this already, but I don't use Facebook, and I do it very deliberately, just as a small act of resistance to Big Brother being everywhere.
You see, we see this trend. This is just catching up. I mean, in 1978, we had globalization with Margaret Thatcher coming out, and all of a sudden, globalization business took off running, and the rest of the infrastructure, the unions and the accounting systems and the law systems for international coverage, seem to be running down the street with their pants half down, trying to catch up and put in place international standards. And I think the same thing is true here, isn't it? That it's out of the box, Pandora's box, and we're trying to catch up.
The good news is because of the Second World War and the Nazi experience, the Europeans, especially the Germans and all continental Europeans, take data protection legislation very seriously. When I'm talking about data protection, it's the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. It's not every aspect of personal information. So if you think somebody's putting something in your brain to read your brain waves, that's not something that's in the data protection field. It's privacy, but it's unrelated. So there was a general European data protection directive developed in the mid-1990s, and the latest iteration of it is coming out next year. And it has American companies much up in arms because they don't believe in that highly regulatory approach to data protection. The worst privacy protections in the world are in the United States, but they have the most privacy legislation in the world. Every state got multiple laws, but they don't have generic laws. Like there's a public sector and a private sector data protection law in France and in Germany that has to meet an international standard.
Yeah.
And from an American point of view, or from the Google's point of view, they're going to be fined substantially for non-compliance. And they don't like that kind of interference with free corporate will of doing things. On the other hand, they can afford all the fines in the world. And I'm quite amused by the fact that a product that's in use here at Royal Roads for teaching, probably you have some of your courses use it, I'm not going to mention the product, but the data is now stored, I think, on Amazon Web Services, where in Ireland. That's contrary to British Columbia law regulating an institution like Royal Roads, so people are going to have to consent to use the product. On the other hand, Ireland, and I have Irish heritage, which is incidental to all of this, has only 5 million people. Guess how many people they have working in data protection? 160 as of this year, 160. And the reason is Apple and Google and all these big high-tech companies have offshore operations in Ireland.
Of course. Tax advantages.
Yeah.
Interesting. Dave, let's move a little bit now, if we can, into what we're doing at Royal Roads. Anything specific here you can share with us, and things that, as students, but also as practitioners in their own business, any lessons learned or steps you're taking or research or any observations?
I'm actually have been working here as a consultant for the last 6 months, seeing what Royal Roads is and isn't doing in terms of privacy compliance, Freedom of Information compliance, and records management. If you're going to reply to a Freedom of Information Act request for information for records, you've got to know what you've got.
Yeah.
And there's also electronic records here at the university that have been created almost endlessly, because you started with the age of the internet.
Yeah.
So you've had all kinds of electronic records, and access controls is fundamental. Again, listening to me, you might say, wow, this is really boring. Access controls, records management, but that's fundamental good housekeeping in your company. If you've had a job 5 years ago that gave you access to some corporate assets, whether corporate or personal information within your company, and 5 years later you've been through 4 more jobs and you still have all those accesses, that's out of control, because you have to implement the need to know principle.
It's interesting, David, but the challenge, it seems to me, is certainly government have the resources and can get more resources to fulfill all these requirements. The challenge, I think, for entrepreneurs, small firms, small business, and 98% of Canadian business are small business, where do they get the resources to do all this?
I hear about this a lot from high-tech startups here in Victoria, and I've been lucky enough to work for 2 or 3 of them, shall remain nameless, but they're all doing interesting things. And when these young CEOs, all under the age of 30, come to see me, and they sit in my living room or my office.
How does that make you feel?
I say, no, I always have privacy sticker shock, as I call it. And I kind of say, you're doing what?
Yeah.
You're surrounding a building with an electronic shield, and you can actually measure all of the open communications in and out, like on an Air Force base in Bagram or someplace like that. They can do that. Well, how does something like that fit in with privacy legislation? And of course, I help them for reasonable amounts of money by my standards, get their house in order so they understand what their privacy obligations are. I helped them co-invent a tool called a privacy impact assessment in the mid-1990s. And so if you're building a new tool or something like that with privacy implications, because there's a lot of personal information involved, you want to ask your staff to get a privacy impact assessment done. Some of it's simply filling out a form.
Where do they get that? We have folks out here with their own businesses and one thing or another. Who would they contact?
They call a privacy consultant. And if you go on the web and you enter in privacy consultants are coming out of the walls, I obviously think some are better than others. But
may I be so bold as to simply, I'm going to put your name up here anyway, can I put a phone number on there?
I'm on the internet. Just enter my name and you'll get my
you get that
address and
way. Okay.
phone number and things
Good.
like that. But you see, if you do a privacy impact assessment for the product, it helps the client understand what the security risks are. Here's something you have to tighten up. And then what we try to do, if it's something cutting edge and really novel, we take it to the local privacy commissioner. There's an information privacy commissioner for British Columbia. There's a very active one in Ontario. My pals are running the Alberta show. There's a federal privacy commissioner. So depending on the sensitivity of the application, a privacy impact assessment, you Google the term, you'll see what they look like, will help assuage the anxieties on privacy and security of the privacy commissioner. Or they'll make suggestions.
I don't know how much of a defense it would be, but it seems to me that if a small startup firm took a consultant such as yourself, got the briefing as to where the leaks and where the damage could occur, and then failed to take action, and some of the data was released, they've stepped into a landmine because now they knew or ought to have known.
I said to somebody yesterday who's been in healthcare for 20, 30 years, have you ever managed a privacy breach? And what do you do when your client calls you up and says, we had a break-in in a GP's office in Vancouver last night, that's my client, and they stole 6 hard drives.
Jeez.
And we're not sure what, they're all of the clinic records that are being digitized, and we're not sure whether the widgets were encrypted. Thank God, after 2 days, they discovered it was encrypted, so no harm could come. But you can't store data that isn't encrypted to a secure socket level. 256-bit encryption is the standard. Now, I can say something like that and say, well, how do you do that? Well, I don't know how to do it, but there are security people who do know how to do it. And if you store your data with one of the big cloud operations, and most people are nowadays, Amazon created this amazing web service for itself. It says, then they're smart enough to say, why do we sell it to everybody else? So no wonder their stock's worth more than $1,000 this week.
Yeah, I have to say I've got a good computer support person who has put an encrypting device behind my machines backed up daily, but it is encrypted.
Yeah.
And I've got nervousness about the cloud, so I have nothing up in the cloud to my knowledge.
Well, I have a lot of confidence in good security.
Yeah.
And I've toured some over the years, going back 25 years, some of these massive, what are now called cloud operations. And the security they have is unbelievable. You can still have problems, but they guarantee 99.9% reliability.
Yeah.
And they've just got so sophisticated, redundant backups, it's astonishing.
Yeah.
So the security side is easier than the privacy side. What can you collect about somebody? Well, you can collect any information that's relevant to their care. Well, I was looking at an app yesterday that's used to allow general practitioners to talk to a specialist about a particular patient and get quick answers by a phone call that's returned by the specialist. And so I was wondering, how stigmatizing would some of this information be? And it turns out there's no personal information in the record that's kept if a family physician keeps the record. But the range of specialists that could be consulted, including transgender specialists, psychiatrists, addiction specialists. So the mere fact that a doctor is calling a specialist about an identifiable patient, about addictions or some other sensitive, stigmatizing matter, much as you want the care, but that's the HIV records. These are the kinds of things that are highly concerning, and that's why I've had the most interesting time since 1999 as a consultant working in the healthcare field, because that's the most important. We all have to give our information to get care. If you're my doctor and I go to see you and I refuse to say anything to you, guess what? They're going to show you out the door.
Yeah.
And if you don't tell them what's actually wrong with you, how you're actually feeling, and he or she will be careful, I think, about how they enter records. They're quite sensitive to not writing down your deepest, darkest thoughts.
Just anecdotal is that this gene checking that they've been doing is at My23. I'm not sure the right name. It's a little app they do. They take a bit of your
Genetic testing.
genetic testing, and I think it's been shown it's not entirely everything they pumped it up initially as. But the interesting thing is that increasingly in the States, there's reports of insurance companies saying, if you've had that test, you must share with us, or we don't give you insurance.
Yeah.
Well, that's fraught with dangers, isn't it?
Yeah. Canada has introduced some genetic privacy legislation at the national level. The Trudeau government is not too happy with it for some reason, and they're sending it, I think, to the Supreme Court of Canada for checking. But at Christmas time this year, a couple of my friends said, oh, guess what my daughter gave me? A genetic testing kit, which is worth a couple $100. And I said, for God's sake, don't do that. You have no idea what you're getting into. What I learned in the 90s when this debate first started was that you should never get genetic testing without genetic counseling. Because once you learn something, I've got 7 brothers and sisters. I could learn something about myself that would be highly relevant to them, and they might not want to know.
Yeah.
I might not know X or Y or Z. They may not want to know.
Yeah. And if it was accurate, and I'd say
If
in
it
this
would
case,
be
there's a question
inaccuracies,
as how the robustness of this test.
And the reality is, with what little I know about genetic testing, they tell you stuff like, I mean, that 90% of us have some kind of Mongol heritage or some, you know, so much interbreeding going back over the millennia. And with the information you get, there's nothing much they can do with it, other than stigmatize you for life insurance purposes or, you know, disability insurance or whatever else there is. So it's another example of something that's cutting edge where you've got to be careful and cautious. And I'd like to tell people that every technological innovation in the 19th century was seen to be a great challenge to personal privacy, including the use of photography at a wedding in Boston that led Warren and Brandeis to write one of the most famous law review articles ever on the right to privacy. And what they were objecting to was the paparazzi taking pictures at the family wedding and publishing them in the newspapers. Well, compared to what they're doing now, where Aristotle Onassis tipped off the paparazzi in Greece, where they could find Jacqueline Kennedy nude on a beach, or Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis nude on a beach. I mean, the stuff that goes on nowadays, and the drones.
That was tame. The drones, another security issue. Another security issue. Had a thought and a slip. Frailty of mind with age, I think, steps in. Let me push on with a couple other things. I may well come back to it. You sent me an article recently about radical transparency in private companies, and that's where companies increasingly today, some private companies in the States today are starting on this new trend, and it seems to be working, that they're getting more sales, goes to bottom line, happier culture, where they actually release on the internet wide open for everybody to see their salaries, their why they let folks go, if a block has to be let go. They share this with the whole general public and get the feedback. In marketing, we have this where we used to have push and pull marketing things. Now it's this hybrid convergence marketing, where you sort of get the customer involved and help shape the product when you buy a car online. Well, they're trying the same thing here, that we're saying, okay, we're going to share our cash flow and what's coming in, who our contracts are, etc., and make the argument that it's good for the company and good for the bottom line. David, what are the dangers in that, of sharing all this information?
I rather was struck by that example as kind of creative disruption. It's trying something that's outside the normal paradigm, because normally when I taught at the University of Western Ontario, nobody really knew what anybody else was earning. Nowadays, if you teach at Royal Roads and earn above a certain amount, something like $75,000, it's public information what you're paid. Partly it's because it's public money that's being spent to run Royal Roads University or the University of Western Ontario. I think it's wonderful to see creative young people trying a new tack like that, and seeing if it in fact makes for a healthier environment. When people know that a certain systems engineer is paid $250,000 a year plus a big bonus because he or she's done amazing things, and it gives everybody a level to aspire to. I mean, they tell me, for example, in these, everybody brags about our startup high-techs in Victoria. There's hundreds of them, apparently. But they don't pay much money, and they don't make much money.
You do it for love.
I don't think they're doing it. They're not doing it for love. Even you can't persuade me of that, professor of business. But they want to be in on the ground floor, and they want to be doing exciting work. And I'm amazed, they go to graduate school, and their graduate project is to create a startup. That's pretty entrepreneurial, and I'm all for that. So you're talking about privacy entrepreneurship in a way,
Yep.
or open government, openness, and God bless them for trying something like that.
And certainly that's the trend among millennials. It's shown that they like this collaborative commons. You and I are old guard, about the same age group, that we tend to want a patent license, protect our knowledge, and be paid for it. Increasingly, those folks under 30 want to go on YouTube and share how to make bread and how to build bombs and whatever they want to do, but it's all free training and education, which in our day we tried to charge for.
Yeah.
And now we have some universities like Harvard and Wharton and others with MOOCs and stuff is free out there to get education.
Well, I have been an academic since 1965, been around university since 1958, despite my youthful appearance, ha ha. And when I look at how I can do research today, I live within a mile of the University of Victoria Library, have access to it. I almost never go to a library. I have online access to almost anything I want, and I have online access to the university catalog at UVic, which often gives you access to articles and things from law reviews and whatever else I want to look at. So it's a staggering, I mean, the world has become a much better place, I believe, since 1995, despite terrorism and poverty and inequality and all these other social ills that we can't ignore. But in general, the dark side, there is an element of the dark side. And WikiLeaks and some of these kinds of things that are very controversial probably shouldn't be happening. But they're going to happen. There's always going to be people who will be whistleblowers, and that's just part of the regime we live in.
It comes with it.
It's part of the evolution of our democracy. And I guess I'm just startled at our respective ages and how things have evolved in our lifetime.
Well,
and if we live another 10 or 15 years, God knows where it's going to go. The Internet of everything will have really taken over.
It would be nice. When I digress just briefly, I remember my research and doing papers in those days consisted of getting about 10 books off the shelf, photocopying on select pages, handwriting out the in-between bits, cut and paste, then type it all up, and that was the extent of the research on a typical paper at that level of change. Dave, let me push on then with another one. That's the question of digital trust. In order for these apps and digital banking to work and the aspect of facial recognition, now I saw some American companies actually people volunteer to put chips in their hands to save some time on access into the buildings and one thing or another. All this mark of the beast stuff. I'm not sure we have digital trust. How are we going to acquire that? And how do we get it and instill it in businesses?
If I just stick to the privacy debate, it's disappointing to me that Facebook and Google and Microsoft have regularly changed their privacy policies or terms of service in ways that are hostile to my privacy interests. And thank God for the official privacy commissioners of British Columbia, Canada, Germany, France, the United Kingdom. There's none in the United States. That they have done their job and they've tackled Google and Facebook. And I'm not trying to signal them out as particularly bad people. They're highly progressive companies. But they think they can do whatever they want with our personal information if it's going to create more huge income trails for themselves. And they have to accept the fact in our democratic societies there are protections for human rights. And that's fundamentally what we're talking about here. Privacy is a fundamental democratic right. The professor I worked for in 1964 and 7, Alan Weston, wrote a book called Privacy and Freedom. That was prescient to talk. I mean, I often, why is he throwing in freedom? Well, privacy is an essential component of the free societies we want to live in. I'm not saying it trumps everything. Counterterrorism measures are very important. We've got to have police and law enforcement and all this stuff. But creating the appropriate balance is very difficult, especially right now in 2017.
And sometimes I get a sense on that scale of our privacy and freedoms versus the public need for security is that lots of folks over here advocate and do, but there's not a lot of folks speaking for us on this side of the ledger. Yeah,
you're perfectly right. You know, the Privacy Commissioner of British Columbia, God bless him, has less than 40 staff, and he runs a freedom of information regime and a privacy regime. And as I mentioned earlier, there's 380,000 organizations supposed to comply with the Personal Information Protection Act.
Now, you did that for a number of years. You were the BC.
I was there, and I had 20 or 25 staff from 93 to 99. So their ultimate goal is to help encourage the private sector to recognize, and governments themselves, how important public trust is if they're going to be able to do business. If you're appearing on the front page of the Globe and Mail and the New York Times for doing nasty things, that's not going to help your bottom line.
No, we have the Bentley ethical test, and that's one of the things. How did you feel is in the paper tomorrow?
Yeah.
And there's 6-fold tests, and that's one of the criteria to measure ethics. A good point. David, you talked about, and what you just said leads on. I'm just reading here for a few seconds. Again, back on data privacy for a few minutes, that just a month or two ago, the American Congress and the President passed that ISP providers now have free reign over everything that we do online. In fact, we'll be double dipping. They'll be able to charge us monthly for the internet service, but then they can take this data and use it and lever it to sell to marketeers, etc., to enhance their bottom line further. And it's going to result in this almost where before we said the idea of convergence marketing, they can tailor it just to you, but this is almost super tailoring of advertisements to you. In fact, with artificial intelligence, which is just around the corner, indeed breakthroughs are making as we talk, and that they're going to be able to, with quantum computers, actually go so fast that they can take the data and understand it's not just the Facebook data that these machines have, it's every piece out there that you've ever done goes into this data box. And they're able to take all that data, and the quantum computers will be able to scan that material very quickly, and not only just understand what you've said, but to be able to make a pretty educated guess what the question's going to be that you're going to raise before you even think of that question.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty scary with this information and the liberty here. And so my question for you, right, might be a little bit, is that with this integrated economic interdependence that we have with America right now, although this is an American law that allows these large companies, Verizon and others, to have this absolute control over everything we do, cars we drive, the phone in your pocket, your travels, and analyze all that data analytics into the system. In Canada, should we be concerned because there's economic independence? I don't think we don't have a choice.
I think the United States is the wild west of privacy protection in the land of rugged individualism. They want self-regulation. They don't want government regulation of the private sector as well as the public sector. The rest of the world, the civilized world, even not to mention Singapore and Hong Kong and places like that, and Australia and New Zealand, we all want regulation. And if these big businesses are going to work internationally, they're going to have to deal with the Europeans. And thank God, the European Union, despite Brexit, still is a very, very powerful economic entity. And their human rights specialists, privacy commissioners, data protection commissioners, are willing to stand up to the Facebooks. In fact, some of them love a fight. And they have fining ability. The Spanish and Portuguese privacy commissioners they earn a lot of their income from fines. So does the Information Commission in the United Kingdom, as I understand it. And so they love fining people if they do really stupid things. Now, it could be that Facebook and Apple can pay whatever the heck fines are ever imposed because they make so much money. And I don't like that idea. And I want them all to be good corporate citizens and accept limitations of what they can do. It's not a wide open Wild West. It shouldn't be.
Corporate governance should require that they pay attention to this. In fact, you mentioned Spain. I was doing some research the other day, and a number of years back we talked about human rights. I was doing work on the indigenous folks in Canada's north, and Spain's the only nation in the world that's actually given human rights to animals, to gorillas. That took me back a step, but they actually have human rights for gorillas in Spain. We're still struggling to get them for indigenous people up north. David, the role of encryption, we talked about it briefly today. They have these virtual private networks that we can, if you want to keep your materials secret in a way and unsourceable, you can go through these companies and use their ISPN and have some question of they say it's safe, but of course the question is, can we trust these companies to do that? And it's certainly an emerging opportunity that we're going to have to pay for our privacy as we go forward. And so, David, your thoughts on encryption? It seems to me the more this Orwellian world takes over and starts looking at all our pieces of paper, like the underground economy for income, I think it's going to drive us all into an underground using encryptions and things like this because we don't want to take this risk. Comments?
Getting good, high-quality security is a difficult task. It's available, and everybody should be using it. But, for example, there's a PharmaNet prescription database in British Columbia that I opposed when it was created around 1995 because I knew they couldn't build an adequate protection. And every prescription you get as an individual is in there under your name. And you can put a controller who can access, but I'm one of the few people who's ever done that because I knew about it. Most people don't know that. And a gang of hackers have taken the identities of a few physicians in British Columbia in the last year or so, and have been breaking into that system and getting personal information on individuals and using it to compromise them. And you can imagine with your prescriptions, you could have some very stigmatizing information about you, or information about your credit cards and things like that. So it shocks the heck out of me, and that's why the more sensitive the database, the more I'm concerned about the highest quality of encryption being in place.
This comes at a cost, doesn't it?
No, but as far as I know, the cost of encryption is de minimis, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
And if all of the big companies now, starting with TELUS and Bell Canada and the big American companies, they've all built massive interconnected cloud systems, so that the data, they don't even know where your data is stored. It could be in Dublin, it could be in Hong Kong, it could be in Toronto, it could be in Kansas, Nebraska. And they're all interconnected and backed up, and there's great redundancies there. I mean, I may be naive, and I'm certainly no security specialist, and I do read some of the security stuff, and thank God there are some very practical security people around. And the Electronic Privacy Information Center in Washington, D.C., it's called EPIC. It has a terrific website, and it has very strong literature and literature reviews organized by topic, and they would get into all the encryption stuff at a level that some of the audience might like to appreciate.
It's interesting. Just to digress for a minute, but you talk about the data security, and I don't know how much you're aware, but we certainly have 2 satellites right now over our heads from the North Koreans, unknown what's in it. Talk of electronic magnetic pulse that would fry these sort of systems. And my concern might be, or generally our concern might be, how robust are these clouds, etc., to take that sort of impact? Will we lose all our data, our bank digital money?
I think people like you and your audience should be asking those kinds of questions. And just as I'm talking about the frequency of data breaches, and at the other side of my conversation is the strength of available security. Well, why are there so many data breaches? The government of Canada, the government of the United States, having all kinds of data breaches and systems that don't work.
Yeah.
I mean, it's much worse if you're trying to use the Phoenix pay system at the federal government to get your paycheck, and they're taking your mortgage away because you can't make your payment because you haven't been paid for 9 months.
Yeah.
I mean, so we haven't reached technological nirvana yet, to put it mildly.
Well, God's not finished with us yet. One small step at a time, I suppose. David, getting close to the end, but we talked briefly about social media controlling our personal information. You sent me an interesting article on input health, about the idea of using chat rooms, forums, message boards, and other interactive features. And I read that with interest, but again, it seems fraught with dangers.
Yeah. I'm not going to associate the point with any particular company, but you can't basically get away with saying, you can use our platform for whatever it is you want to use it for, but whatever you do, we're not interested in what you do. You have to have some monitoring, because all of you are subject to the same rules and regulations, whether it's on defamation or libel or privacy protection or open government. There are rules of the road. And, you know, from our audience's point of view, there are rules of the road for everything. If you're in HR, there's ways of doing things. If you're in sales, there's proper ways of doing things. As you've referred several times, there's ethical ways of doing things. Well, when it comes to the collection use of personal information or the disclosure of general information, there are rules of the road. And most of them are quite similar from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in Western industrial societies. And it behooves you, as part of all the other things you're supposed to learn something about, to take away from this kind of discussion the fact that there's some basic knowledge that you should have about the 10 privacy principles, what's generally available under freedom of information legislation, what's generally not available, how the system works, how the systems of appeals built into it. And now, after 20 or 30 or 40 years, there's lots of jurisprudence on the subject. So the Supreme Court of Canada, the Court of Appeal in British Columbia have all intervened to establish, not always wisely in our opinion, where the fine line should be between privacy and civil rights and human rights and intrusion and things like that.
Dave, that's a pretty good wrap-up on some of the stuff. Just getting close to closing, but to help, we've got not-for-profit folks watching out there. We've got small companies. We've got folks in senior management positions with large companies watching today, as well as in the student roles. My question is, for dummies, with due respect to our audience and others, is there some sites they can go to when you talk about the 10 principles for privacy, et cetera? Are there sites out there you'd recommend that we could have a quick look at to get us to get into the game?
There are privacy commissioners in every province and territory of Canada, and information commissioners. They have different names. All of them have websites. There's a federal website. All of their websites are quite good. British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and the federal government. They're fairly easy to navigate, and they've got their guides for business people to all of these pieces
Excellent.
of legislation.
Good. Okay, that's a good tip. Good tip. Yeah. Well, Dave, I think we've just about finished up today. Is there any last-minute comments? Or
No, I'm just glad you didn't get me into even more things I don't know much about.
Well, we have hardly. Well, we should let them know as two Irishmen. It was the Irish that saved Western civilization.
Of course. Yeah.
Good. Well, folks, that's about it for today. It was a big topic, lots in here. We've just scratched the surface, but hopefully we've raised the awareness, the appreciation of the importance of this dark side of the internet to you folks and running your organizations. You're going to have to spend a little time looking at it to get some sense of the direction this whole world is opening up in. It's quite concerning. David, thank you for coming and sharing a few moments with us. Much appreciated.
Pleasure.
See you again.